How does something like time initially show itself for everyday, circumspect taking care? In what mode of taking care and using tools does it become explicitly accessible? If time has been made public with the disclosedness of world, if it has always already been taken care of with the discoveredness of inner-worldly beings belonging to the disclosedness of world, since Dasein calculates time reckoning with itself, then the mode of behavior in which one orients oneself explicitly toward time lies in the use of the clock. The existential and temporal meaning of the clock turns out to be making present of the moving pointer. By following the positions of the pointer in a way that makes present, one counts them. This making present temporalizes itself in the ecstatic unity of a retaining that awaits. To retain the on that former occasion in making present means that in saying, now one is open for the horizon of the earlier, that is, the now no longer. To await the then in making present means that in saying, now one is open for the horizon of the later, that is, the now not yet. What shows itself in this making present is time. Then how are we to define the time manifest in the horizon of the use of the clock that is circumspect and takes time for itself in taking care? This time is what is counted, showing itself in following, making present, and counting the moving pointer in such a way that making present temporalizes itself in ecstatic unity with retaining and awaiting horizontally open according to the earlier and later. But that is nothing more than an existential and ontological interpretation of the definition that Aristotle gave of time. Toino Yap tilde on 411 v9 xtvlj 6 Euxatia to it podi epov za, this, namely, is time, that which is counted in the motion encountered in the horizon of the earlier and the later. 7. As strange as this definition may appear at first glance, it is self-evident and genuinely drawn if the existential and ontological horizon from which Aristotle took it is delimited. The origin of time thus revealed is not a problem for Aristotle. His interpretation of time, rather, moves in the direction of the natural understanding of being. However, since that understanding and the being understood in it have been made a problem in principle in our present inquiry, the Aristotelian analysis of time can be thematically interpreted only after the solution to the question of being, and indeed in such a way that that analysis gains a fundamental significance for a positive appropriation of the critically limited line of questioning of ancient ontology in general. All subsequent discussion of the concept of time fundamentally holds itself to the Aristotelian definition. That is, it makes time thematic in the way that it shows itself in circumspect taking care. Time is what is counted. That is, it is what is expressed and what is meant, although unthematically in the making present of the moving pointer or shadow. In making present what is moved in its motion, one says, now here, and so on. What is counted are the nows, and they show themselves in every now, as right away no longer now and just now not yet. The world time caught sight of in this way in the use of the clock we shall call now time. The more naturally the taking care of time that gives itself time reckons with time, the less it dwells together with the expressed time as such. Rather, it is lost in the useful things taken care of that always have their time. The more naturally taking care determines and specifies time, that is, the less it is directed toward treating time as such thematically, all the more does the being together with what is taken care of, the being together making present and falling prey, say unhesitatingly, whether with or without utterance, now then, on that former occasion. And thus time shows itself for the vulgar understanding as a succession of constantly present, vorhanden nows that pass away and arrive at the same time. Time is understood as a sequence, as the flux of nows, as the course of time. What is implied by this interpretation of world time taken care of? We can answer this if we go back to the complete essential structure of world time and compare this with that with which the vulgar understanding of time is acquainted. We set forth datability as the first essential factor of time taken care of. It is grounded in the ecstatic constitution of temporality. The now is essentially a now that. The datable now that is understood in taking care, although not grasped as such, is always appropriate or inappropriate. Significance belongs to the now structure. Thus we call time taken care of world time. In the vulgar interpretation of time as a succession of nows, both datability and significance are lacking. The characterization of time as pure sequence does not let these two structures appear. The vulgar interpretation of time covers them over. The ecstatic and horizontal constitution of temporality, in which the datability and significance of the now are grounded, is leveled down by this covering over. The nows are cut off from these relations, so to speak, and as thus cut off, they simply range themselves along after one another so as to constitute the succession. This covering over and leveling down of world time that is carried out by the vulgar understanding of time is no accident. Rather, precisely because the everyday interpretation of time keeps itself solely in the perspective of common sense taking care, and because it understands only what shows itself in this horizon, these structures must escape. What is counted in the measurement of time taken care of, the now, is also understood in taking care of things at hand and present vorhand. Since this taking care of time comes back to the time itself that has also been understood and contemplates it, it sees the nows that are also somehow there, in the horizon of the understanding of being by which this taking care is itself constantly guided. The nows are thus in a way also present, that is, beings are encountered and also the now. Although it is not explicitly stated that the nows are present like things, still they are seen, ontologically in the horizon of the idea of objective presence vorhanden. The nows pass away, and the past ones constitute the past. The nows arrive, and the future ones define the future. The vulgar interpretation of world time, as now time, does not have the horizon available at all by which such things as world, significance, and datability can be made more accessible. These structures remain necessarily covered over, all the more so since the vulgar interpretation of time consolidates this covering over by the way in which it conceptually develops its characterization of time. The succession of nows is interpreted as something somehow objectively present, for it itself moves in time. We say that in every now it is now, in every now it already disappears. The now is now in every now, thus constantly present as the same, even if in every now another may be disappearing as it arrives. Yet it does show at the same time the constant presence of itself as this changing thing. Thus even Plato, who had this perspective of time as a succession of nows that come into being and pass away, had to call time the image of eternity, Ix 6. Tilde foci extiviarelt javin va athug chi 81 a exo c micro co via micro o tilde pavavite, c micro pound, vaftiag ai, vug via vicati and pll micro o v athlov exova. Tiaftiav av 8, rl expav of thvo micro a exa micro cv. Lo, the succession of nows is uninterrupted and has no gaps. No matter how far we penetrate in dividing the now, it is still always now. One regards the continuity of time in the horizon of something indissolubly present. Ontologically oriented towards something constantly present, one either looks for the problem of the continuity of time, or one leaves the aporia alone. Here the specific structure of world time must remain covered over, since it is spanned together with ecstatically founded datability. The spanness of time is not understood in terms of the horizontal being stretched along of the ecstatic unity of temporality that has made itself public in taking care of time. The fact that it is always already now in every now, no matter how momentary, must be conceived in terms of what is still earlier, out of which every now arises. That is, it must be conceived in terms of the ecstatically being stretched along of the temporality that is foreign to any continuity of something present, but that in turn presents the condition of the possibility of the access to something continuous and present. The main thesis of the vulgar interpretation of time, namely, that time is infinite, reveals most penetratingly the leveling down and covering over of world time, and thus of temporality in general belonging to this interpretation. Initially, time presents itself as an uninterrupted succession of now. Every now is already either just now or a right away. If the characterization of time keeps primarily and exclusively to this succession, then, in principle, no beginning and no end can be found in it as such. Every last now, as a now, is always already a right away that is no longer, thus it is time in the sense of the no longer now, of the past. Every first now is always a just now not yet, thus it is time in the sense of the not yet now, the future. Time is thus endless in both directions. This thesis about time is possible only on the basis of an orientation toward a free-floating in itself of a course of nows objectively present, whereby the complete phenomenon of the now is covered over with regard to the datability, worldliness, spanness, and publicness of Dasein, so that it has dwindled to an unrecognizable fragment. If one thinks the succession of nows to the end, either from the perspective of objective presence or the lack of it, an end can never be found. In this way of thinking time through to the end, one must always think more time. From this one concludes that time is infinite. But in what is this leveling down of world time and covering over of temporality ground? In the being of Dasein itself that we interpret it as care in a preparatory way, thrown and entangled, Dasein is initially and for the most part lost in what it takes care of. But in this lostness, the flight of Dasein from its authentic existence that we characterized as anticipatory resoluteness makes itself known, and this is a flight that covers over. In such heedful fleeing lies the flight from death, that is, a looking away from the end of being in the world. This looking away from is in itself a mode of the ecstatic futural being toward the end. Looking away from finitude, the inauthentic temporality of entangled everyday Dasein must fail to recognize authentic futurality, and thus temporality in general. And if the vulgar understanding of Dasein is guided by the they, then the self-forgetful representation of the infinity of public time can first anchor itself. They never dies because it is unable to die, since death is always my own and is understood authentically only in anticipatory resoluteness in an existential way. They, which never dies and misunderstands being toward then, nonetheless interprets the flight from death in a characteristic way. Up to the end, it always has more time. Here a way of having time makes itself known in the sense of being able to lose it, right now this, then that. Here it is not as if the finitude of time were understood, but quite the opposite. Taking care is out to snatch as much as possible from time that is still coming and goes on. Publicly, time is something that everyone can and does take. The leveled-down succession of nows remains completely unrecognizable with regard to its provenance from the temporality of individual Dasein in everyday being with one another. How is the course of time to be affected at all if a human being, present in time, no longer existed? Time goes on as it already was, after all, when a human being entered life. One knows only public time that, leveled down, belongs to everyone, and that means to no one. However, just as one who flees death is pursued by it even as one evades it, and just as in turning away from it one has to see it nonetheless, the harmless, endless succession of nows that just runs on imposes itself on Dasein in a remarkably enigmatic way. Why do we say that time passes away when we do not emphasize just as much how it comes into being? With regard to the pure succession of nows, both could, after all, be said with equal justification. In talking about time's passing away, Dasein ultimately understands more about time than it would like to admit. That is, the temporality in which world time temporalizes itself is not completely closed off despite all covering over. Talking about time's passing away gives expression to the experience that time cannot be halted. This experience is again possible only on the basis of wanting to halt time. Herein lies an inauthentic awaiting of moments that already forgets the moments as they slip by. The awaiting of inauthentic existence that makes present and forgets is the condition of the possibility of the vulgar experience of time's passing away. Since Dasein is futural in being ahead of itself, it must, in awaiting, understand the succession of nows as one that slips away and passes away. Dasein knows fleeting time from the fleeting knowledge of its death. In the kind of talk that emphasizes time's passing away, the finite futurality of the temporality of Dasein is publicly reflected. And since even in the talk about time's passing away death can remain covered over, time shows itself as a passing away in itself. But even in this pure succession of nows passing away in itself, primordial time reveals itself in spite of all leveling down and covering over. The vulgar interpretation determines the flux of time as an irreversible succession. Why can time not be reversed? Especially when one looks exclusively at the flux of nows, it is incomprehensible in itself why the sequence of nows should not accommodate itself to the reverse direction. The impossibility of this reversal has its basis in the provenance of public time and temporality, whose temporalizing, primarily futural, goes ecstatically toward its end in such a way that it is already toward its end. The vulgar characterization of time as an endless, irreversible succession of nows passing away arises from the temporality of entangled Dasein. The vulgar representation of time has its natural justification. It belongs to the everyday kind of being of Dasein and to the understanding of being initially dominant. Thus even history is initially, and for the most part understood publicly as an occurrence within time. This interpretation of time loses its exclusive and distinctive justification only if it claims to convey the true concept of time and to be able to sketch out the sole possible horizon for the interpretation of time. Rather, we found that only from the temporality of Dasein and its temporalizing does it become intelligible why and how world time belongs to it. This interpretation of the complete structure of world time is drawn from temporality and gives us guidelines for seeing the covering over contained in the vulgar concept of time, and for estimating how far the ecstatic and horizontal constitution of temporality has been leveled down. This orientation toward the temporality of Dasein, however, at the same time makes it possible to demonstrate the provenance and the factical necessity of this covering over that levels down, and to examine the arguments for the vulgar theses on time. On the other hand, from the reverse direction, umjikayat temporality remains inaccessible in the horizon of the vulgar understanding of time. Not only must now time be oriented primarily toward temporality in the order of possible interpretation, but it temporalizes itself only in the inauthentic temporality of Dasein. So, if we pay attention to the derivation of now time from temporality, we are justified in addressing temporality as primordial time. Ecstatic and horizontal temporality temporalizes itself primarily out of the future. However, the vulgar understanding of time sees the fundamental phenomenon of time in the now, and indeed in the sheer now, cut off in its complete structure, that is called the present. One can gather from this that there is in principle no prospect of explaining, or even deriving the ecstatic and horizontal phenomenon of the moment that belongs to authentic temporality from this now. Thus the ecstatically understood future, the datable, significant then, does not coincide with the vulgar concept of the future, in the sense of the sheer nows that have not yet arrived and are only arriving. Nor does the ecstatic having been, the datable, significant on that former occasion, coincide with the concept of the past in the sense of the past sheer now. The now is not pregnant with the not yet now, but rather the present arises from the future in the primordial, ecstatic unity of the temporalizing of temporality. Although, initially and for the most part, the vulgar experience of time knows only world time, it nonetheless also always accords world time an eminent relation to soul and spirit. And it does this even when an explicit and primary orientation toward philosophical questioning of the subject is absent. Two characteristic passages will suffice as evidence for this. Aristotle says, C8 EPTL and V AXXOZE CPV ZEV 6 CP1. Tilde micropound Roman 4 ij EFXL xi and 8 VVRAV XPAV of WVX T1's micro TL OW6 R1 G14. And Augustine writes, In de mihi visum est, nihil esse aliud tempus quam distensionum, sed cuius re nescio. Et murum si non ipsius animi. 15. Thus, in principle, the interpretation of Dasein as temporality does not lie beyond the horizon of the vulgar concept of time. And Hegel made an explicit attempt to point out the way in which time, understood in the vulgar sense, is connected with spirit. For Kant, on the other hand, time is indeed subjective, but stands unconnected next to the I think. The grounds that Hegel explicitly gave for the connection between time and spirit are well suited for clarifying indirectly the foregoing interpretation of Dasein as temporality and our exhibition of the origin of world time from it.